Gallery Tour of Renaissance Artwork by Carly Gibson, May Holmes, Makayla Medeiros, and Anna Wood. Throughout the course of the Renaissance, artists and their works demonstrate the principles of Renaissance humanism and secularism.
Development of the Renaissance. The Renaissance, a word meaning rebirth, was a time period when new styles of art were introduced. Artists weren't referred to as mere artisans anymore. They no longer were creating artworks that were skillful and intricate. It was more about how they wanted to express their feelings on a certain topic or idea. From the words of James Beck, few extraneous details or features were permitted, ensuring that the viewer's attention would be focused on the essence of the theme. A man named Filippo Brunelleschi introduced a new style of artwork called linear perspective. Linear perspective is a type of perspective used by artists in which the relative size, shape, and position of objects are determined by drawn or imagined lines converging at a point on the horizon. Another artist named Masaccio also used perspective. An example is Holy Trinity. Many artists use science and mathematics to paint their paintings. Artists would have to make sure everything was proportional.
The foreground of a composition is the visual plane that appears closest to the viewer, while the background is the plane in a composition perceived furthest from the viewer. Giorgione has woven the technique of background and foreground in his painting by having the landscape around the city framing it, making it the focal point of the painting. He includes background and foreground by making the city and storm smaller, to make it seem farther away. Quoted best from Drs. Stephen Zucker and Dr. Beth Harris, the space between these figures that is extraordinary landscape with a city beyond and a storm in the sky. Giorgione makes the viewer feel included in the painting by having the woman depicted staring at them. This gives all people viewing this work of art a sense of connection to what is being depicted in this scene. In Piero del Francesca's painting of the Baptism of Christ, he paints trees, clouds, and mountains in the background smaller to give the painting a sense of depth. This was a new technique during the Renaissance, making Renaissance paintings more realistic than the two-dimensional paintings produced during the Middle Ages. Said best by the National Gallery, the landscape certainly evokes the local area and makes this painting remarkable. Perspective is a kind of art on a two-dimensional surface that when viewing gives the illusion of depth, height, and width. In the Annunciation, Botticelli gives the painting a sense of depth by making the objects in the window smaller than the interior of the room. He also uses perspective by using lines from the ceiling and floor to make Angel Gabriel and Mary the correct height. Both of these are new techniques, which add to the beauty of the Renaissance art because they give the viewer a more personal, human experience. The Met Museum states that the classical interior of the room rendered with one-point perspective to create the illusion of depth, a technique achieved in early 15th century Florence. The one-point perspective adds to the depth given by background and foreground. The ideal city is a perfect example of linear perspective. Francesca uses perspective to make the painting appear more realistic, as if you're standing on the street with him. What distinguishes the work is the perspective view and the general order of the painting as well as what it represents, says Luca Oniboni, an Italian architect. The inclusion of intricate classical architecture throughout the building, such as arches, columns, can be tied to humanism and the return to more classical times. Francesca's incorporation of linear perspective and classical architecture makes it obvious to any viewer that this is a Renaissance painting. The depth given to the altarpiece by buildings and people, which gradually get smaller, make it a great example of perspective. According to the National Gallery, the painting The painting itself is architecturally rich, containing a variety of buildings arranged on either side of a paved street that stretches deep into a pictorial space. To the right, Crivelli depicts Mary in her bedroom, kneeling on the floor praying. The way this is painted with a doorway flanked by highly ornate Corinthian pilasters offers a view into Mary's bedroom. This door also serves to frame Mary, creating the effect of an altarpiece within an altarpiece. The way Mary is shown here has her more visible to the viewer, which makes her less visible to the Holy Spirits. The crowded streets also adds to the depth of the piece. Shading is the darkening of an illustration to give a three-dimensional look. Raphael used shading along Mary's jaw and shoulders. This painting technique gives Mary a roundness to her face, making her look more alive and authentic. Portraits are often used to convey secularism because the artist has shifted focus away from the church and towards the individual. This painting is similar to some of Raphael's previous works, including his own self-portrait. The shading accumulates along the matron's arm and in the folds of her dress, giving it an erotic connotation, says EPPH. The way Raphael chose to paint this portrait is very typical of Renaissance art. EPPH states that her torso faces her easel, just out of view to the left, which her head turns to check her features in an imaginary mirror, the very canvas we see, which makes the spectator feel more included in the scene that is illustrated. Secularism was important to the Renaissance because it shifted focus away from religion and the church by focusing on everyday life. Humanism is a Renaissance movement that turned away from the ideas of the Middle Ages and returned to the interest in classical Greek and Roman education and the thought that humans have the ability to decide right from wrong. Rogier van der Weyden has woven ideas of humanism into his painting by making Mary reading the main focus of the work. This represents the humanistic idea of returning to classical learning. Humanism also supports individual liberty, so depicting the Magdalene alone emphasizes that idea. The National Gallery states that the Magdalene subsequently devoted her life to holy works and is represented reading a holy book. This is important because it features the return to classical learning, which was so important to the humanistic movement. The books lining the walls of St. Jerome's study, that can also be found throughout the room, emphasize the return to classical education that humanism brought on. The bright colors of the books and the curtain attract the eye to the bookshelf, making it more obvious to the viewer. St. Jerome, being a scholar, also adds to the idea of returning to classical learning. The Detroit Institute of Art claims that painting's inclusion of the books and other objects seen here relate to the saint's intellectual pursuits and take on a significant meaning. These meanings can include the return to classical education and the belief that humans can make their own decisions. The artist chose to highlight the book Mary is reading, making education the main focus of the artwork. Pearls are often used to represent vanity, so the use of pearls in Mary's headpiece emphasized the return to self that the humanistic movement brought upon people of the time. Piero includes details in the painting that would not traditionally be there. The style of her dress, the open book, and the lady pose, like the architecture framing her, drawing on the portrait of the 1400s, says Barberini, National Gallery. The decision to make the Magdalene less traditional can also be traced to a humanistic idea, for Piero felt that he could change something traditional on his own. Humanists were about empowering oneself into making their own decisions.
Secularism is a belief held by people during the Renaissance that a human should focus on their life on earth rather than in the afterlife. Art during the Renaissance depicted secularism through non-religious paintings and celebrations of everyday life and achievements. Portrait of a Lady in Green by Agnolo Bronzino. There has always been some uncertainty about the authorship of this magnificent painting. However, according to the Art of Italy in the Royal Collection Renaissance in Bark, London, 2007, Quote, the sitter may be the daughter of Matteo Sofferoni, end quote, a friend of the artist. Quote, the direct gaze and deceptively simple pose of the figures also typical of Bronzino's portraits, end quote. The lady in the green is the main focus of the painting. Quote, the turn of the head, the reflected light in the shadows of the face, the very slightly parted lips, the depiction of the rings worn in the rounded hands, end quote, are all reflective of Bronzino's work. The artist painted her with great detail and care as he appreciates human life and its imperfections. There is high attention to small detail in her costume, the stitching in her shirt, and the fancy weave of the headpiece she wears. The background is purposely kept simple as a solid color as to allow viewers to focus on the main subject. Portrait of a Young Boy Holding a Drawing by Giovanni Francesco Corotto is perhaps one of the strangest portraits from the Renaissance period. Commonly referred to as Carrot Top, many believe that this is a portrait of Corotto as a young boy. According to independent.co.uk, quote, the boy's eager, slightly toothsome smile gives this picture a place in the history of portraiture, but the page he holds upstages it, end quote. Many believe Corotto asked a child to paint the drawing shown in the picture. Quote, on the lower right, notice the profile eye drawn with an expert hand. We can imagine the boy hanging around in the studio, picking up bits of paper used by the artist or his pupils for sketches, adding his own, end quote. Quote, it's uneven. The scratchy, wobbly lines are persuasive. Some of the formation seem too complex. See its right eye, constructed from curved eyebrow and eyelid. Indeed, the incomplete head in the corner suggests a grown-up approach, end quote. In the painting Peasant Wedding Feast, Renaissance painter Peter Bruegel the Elder shows us a celebration of life and love. This painting depicts a typical peasant celebration, which according to peterbruegel.org, quote, is an accurate portrayal of the customs, costumes, and food at a 16th century peasant wedding, end quote, and, quote, underlines how the Bruegel family was closely tied to the poorer sections of society at a time when artists were more interested in the rich and famous, end quote. Quote, Bruegel captures every minute detail of the scene. The guests, including a well-dressed landowner, sits upon a tub. The food is simple and is probably super porridge, carried to the table on a long, old door, appears to be the center of focus for the guests, end quote. Friends and family are gathered around the bride, wearing a crown, who sits in front of the green wall, end quote. Music is playing and wine is being shared from a common jug. A child also attended, happy to be eating. Quote, Bruegel has taken a slice of history which allows the viewer to observe the festivities and intimate details of a peasant wedding, perhaps just as he did many centuries before, end quote. The Tower of Babel by Peter Bruegel the Elder. According to dailyartmagazine.com, quote, the Tower of Babel wasn't a very popular thing to depict in art, end quote. Bruegel depicted the technical and mechanical details from the supply of building materials in the busy harbor to the various screens and scaffolding of the unfinished brick foundation, end quote. Quote, also by painting this in such a detailed way, we see the craftsmanship and hard work put into the tower. The perspective by which we view this painting from also helps us appreciate the effort put into the final product. Quote, by anchoring the building on the rocky slope, Bruegel creates the impression of static equilibrium. Reaching up to the clouds, the building, however, is optically distorted and appears to have slightly sunk into the ground on the left side. This is an artistic gesture, on the one hand enhancing the impression of the building's monumentality, end quote. Quote, but notice the angle of the arches. They seem slightly tipping, following the line of ascent rather than a correct engineered vertical. Notice the water at the foundation by the gate. If you've ever experienced water damage in your living quarters, you get the idea. In spite of all of its magnificent splendor, the project is flawed in its very design, end quote.